Delighted to have Wayne Paterson, CEO of Anteris, for a chat about the company and what's been happening. How are you doing, Wayne?
Doing great, Michael. Thanks for having me. Good to see you.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. I thought it'd be helpful now to just start with what actually are valves, which is what Anteris focuses on. Where are they used? Can you give us a bit of background around the company?
Sure. And around, I guess, the disease state, when we talk about valves, there are multiple valves actually in your body and several around the heart, the mitral valve and the aortic valve. Basically, valves are designed in your body anatomically to allow blood to flow one way and basically not to flow back in the wrong direction. Now, when those valves become dysfunctional, they either don't open wide enough and then create pressure, a bit like a garden hose when you squeeze the nozzle and the diameter gets smaller, the pressure goes up to that point where that pressure becomes dangerous or even fatal. Um, or they have other problems where they create turbulent flow because there's disruptions within the valve symmetry caused by calcification and irregularities. So they're supposed to be pretty circular, they become less circular. So the valve is very important. The disease we treat is fatal if left untreated, but we didn't certainly start life as a valve company. And in fact, some of your listeners may remember Anteris was a drug company some time ago, and that is my career background is pharmaceuticals globally. And I joined the company as a board member and became chairman. And I was actually pursuing my board career. I joined a NASDAQ board around the same time here in the States, in California. It was very clear to me at the time from where the company was, obviously the share price that was publicly traded on the ASX, that the drug platform was not a viable investment thesis. And so the heritage of the company really built was trying to aim towards it. Now, coming from my background, I can tell you that drug was not commercially viable. It was not going to ever be launched. And it requires about $1 billion to bring a drug to market. And that's the Merck number where I came from in the headquarters. And your chance of success at phase 2 is about 5 to 10%. So Michael, give me $1 billion, your chance of return is 5%. Not a good investment thesis. But we did have one very key technology called ADAPT, which was designed in Australia, which is a collagen material, and it was used in the surgical repair space. Now, I always describe this to physicians and other people up here as a big company tech, something I would have expected to have found at Merck, where I came from. It's really high science. And it was being used in surgical repair. Surgical repair is great, but it's very commoditized. It's about a $50 million market, which I learned after I got here. However, that material is the building block for the market that we entered. So we did have a blank piece of paper where we had the building block. And so that's where we began the journey, really was to look for an investment thesis beyond the drug platform that we had kind of gotten rid of and say, okay, beyond the $50 million market, which is not particularly attractive for the amount of investment it requires to get market share, what else can this material be used for? And of course, the TAVI space was adjacent to us. It's a $10 billion space. And these valves are made from this collagen. They're all made from pretty much the same stuff. So we had the materials, we just didn't have the direction. And so we basically took a blank piece of paper to a very big space and asked physicians what they would like to see, and then decided whether we could achieve that and create an investment thesis. So we wrote the product around an investment thesis. We wrote the commercial plan, the launch plan, everything about 7 years ago.
Right. And how is the valve actually designed? Was that done in-house?
Yeah, absolutely. So here's the thing about this space. You know, it's all well and good to say there's a $10 billion space, and some of the drugs I've launched globally are $5-6 billion drugs per year. So I'm used to the space being that kind of size. It's big for medtech, but certainly normal for pharma. However, you can't just snap your fingers and go, great, no one's done this before, so we're going to go in and take a piece of the action. The valves, so the thing about the disease this way, it's obviously a fatal disease if left untreated. 50% of patients are dead with severe disease in 2 years. No pharmacotherapy. We'll talk about that later. So basically,
just quickly, how do these patients present? Like, what's the patient journey?
Sure. So typically, and it's a weird dynamic, right? Obviously, it does afflict a lot of women, but more so men. We certainly find, and as a compatriot of Australia, I'll tell you this, that Australian men, US men, probably British men, don't tend to go to their doctors and talk about this a whole lot. So we are treating 15% of patients, and it's still a $10 billion market. So keep in mind, there's 85% of patients who are not diagnosed or treated, partly because they don't tell. It is a disease of symptoms. So the first thing you will notice, like a lot of cardiac diseases, is syncope or shortness of breath. Right. So upon exertion, walking up the stairs, going to the bathroom, going shopping, those kind of things, patients will start to notice that exertion requires more breathing and they have to sit and rest and so on. A lot of them will put it down to old age, but this disease starts kicking in maybe in your 60s. There'll be other typical pains that you might get from a lack of oxygenation, such as pains in the chest. But that's really the first one. So they'll present to their doctor. If they tell their doctor they have these symptoms, he will then do some scans, do some other work, and follow on and start to look for some of the telltale signs. And those symptoms, by the way, are pretty common to a lot of cardiac diseases. Right? It's not just aortic stenosis. They will eventually nail it down to a couple of key measurements. So once you get over the symptom presentation, physician then decides, okay, we're going to take a scan, look at a few things. They'll bring it down to a measurement called the mean gradient. And that's how you calibrate the disease. It's a blood pressure measurement measured from within the heart, so not on your arm, not brachial. It's measured in millimeters of mercury, of course. And so your normal range is about 5 to 10 millimeters of mercury. That's what you've got right now, Michael, I can tell. A severe patient gets up to 40 or 50 millimeters of mercury. So that's, you feel that pressure is going up, and that's because the valve isn't functioning. And we've treated patients with 100 millimeters of mercury or more, and that's pretty much end of life kind of treatment. So there's a spectrum of how this disease manifests, from mild to severe, like all diseases. And if you get on it early enough, you start treating it. And there's a couple of ways they could have treated this disease, but they have to change the valve. And the interesting thing to me was you switch out a piece of the anatomy. That's how you fix this disease. The piece that we've been putting back in for 20 years does not look like the piece you were born with, and it doesn't behave like it. And there is our entry point, because it's not physiologically or anatomically correct and doesn't give you a pre-disease curative outcome. DurAVR, a completely different design. So we designed a completely different class of valve. All other valves fit in the bioprosthetic category. We fit in the biomimetic category. So it emulates physiologically and anatomically the valve in your body. We own all the IP, so we own the class. You can't get into that class. But lo and behold, it gives you pre-disease outcomes, which they never got with the other valves. So that's the big differentiator, but was really based on analyzing that gap in the market, because we couldn't come in and make another bioprosthetic. We couldn't come in and make a valve like Edwards, for example, because no one's going to use that. So there's no point trying to raise capital and come to market with a me too in this space unless you've got clinical differentiation. There's no thesis here to play with.
Why don't we talk about what happens at the moment? So you come in, you've had this test, you have high pressure. What are the existing treatment options?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing you're going to do is look at your symptomology. Firstly, is it really debilitating for you? Do they need to take action today, or can they take action tomorrow? Now, increasingly, they're talking about taking action today, a bit like when we look at oncology, which is where I came from. You have an end-of-life patient, which is a stage 4, or you start treating cancers in stage 1. And I've seen that in the time we've been in stenosis. The patients they used to treat really were stage 4 end of life. So they were in their 80s. Those symptoms were probably pretty high. The patient was probably going to be dead in a couple of years. And the two things they could do is give you a surgical valve or a TAVI valve on a catheter like we make. Now, a surgical valve requires having your chest opened up, called a thoracotomy. They bypass your heart, they stop it. They go in and put that valve in surgically. Now, an 85-year-old cannot tolerate that without a high risk of death on the table, so they wouldn't do it. And so they put a catheter-based valve in without opening up the chest. And so that patient at that point, that's what they were designed for. So very high symptoms, end of life, probably going to die in a couple of years. So no problems come up with the valve because the patient passes away. But these days, they're going to look at you and say, are your symptoms debilitating? And if the answer is no, they might wait to see. Now they know if they treat you earlier, you're going to have a better long-term outcome. How old are you? Can we put a surgical valve in? Should we crack your chest, or should we put in a catheter-based TAVR? And then they'll start to look at your mean gradient. Now, if your mean gradient is already 40 or 50 millimeters, they're going to treat you because you're already severe. If it's 20 to 30, they might have a look at your symptoms first and wait and see. So, I mean, every physician is different, but increasingly the age of treatment has come down a lot. So they used to be 83 years old, and now it's 68 years old, kind of mean over the last 5 years. So they're treating patients a lot younger, and they're talking about treating patients without symptoms, right? Because they believe once you get symptoms, there's been a lot of damage done in your vasculature that leads to mortality. So they're trying to, through studies, determine when is the optimal time to actually treat you at the moment.
Right. And those existing transcatheter valves, I guess it's basically a two-player market with some other competitors. But it's really Medtronic and what's the other one?
Edwards.
Can you go through how those work and what the differentiators are there? And it's worth mentioning these are huge companies, like $100 billion companies.
Yeah, so sure. I mean, I think huge is a relative measurement for me. If I come from Merck, where I came from, then Edwards is about the size of one business unit there. So there is a different sense of scale when you launch. But when we look at the technologies, there are basically two, and this is what we learned when we had a blank piece of paper. And again, we wrote our investment thesis around the product, right? So the market is roughly in the States divided between 70% and 30% Medtronic, and has been pretty much that way for a decade. And that's the question for me, is why? Coming from commercial global healthcare, how can you not shift that market share, right? That's stuff at Merck will get you fired. So how do you not move the market share over a decade? And the one thing we learned is the barrier to adoption is, in fact, the delivery system. Self-expanding, which the Medtronic valve is more challenging to use in that it doesn't have a balloon, relies on radial strength of the frame when it's inside the body. And good operators know how to use it, and people who do lower volumes generally are a bit nervous about using that product. I've been in those procedures. They are much more challenging. They take much longer than the Edwards system, which is a balloon-based system, right? So the delivery system, which of course you throw away, once the valve's in place, the catheter gets withdrawn and thrown out. But it's so critically important because you've got a physician on the end. Now, balloon is a lot more control. Once you put the valve inside the body and the valve's crimped down, it's very thin when it's going in. The way it expands back up is that you inflate that balloon to a predetermined amount of atmospheres that you mathematically work out from a scan, get inside the patient, get the valve in place, expand the balloon, it pops the valve out, you then deflate the balloon, the valve stays out, and you pull the catheter and throw it. 90% of the procedures that physicians do are balloon-based no matter what, whether it's a TAVI or anything else. Now, so the self-expanding is the outlier. So the interesting thing, though, Michael, is that the hemodynamics are actually better with the self-expander than they are with the Edwards product, the balloon expandable, which tells you that it's nominal, but it tells you that they're compromising to some extent outcomes for ease of use. Right now, a Sapien valve, the Edwards valve, about 25 minutes to implant, same as our valve, about 25 minutes. The Medtronic valve can take 45 minutes to 1 hour because it is more complex, and that's if everything goes well. So that's pretty much the difference to adoption. But of course, the story is not about the delivery system. It's the price of entry. It's a barrier to adoption. And you talked about the other players. The reason that those other companies, Abbott and Boston, are not in the space is because they're all self-expanding. Only one company went with the balloon expandable. And I couldn't tell you why the rationale was for that. That's why you only really see Medtronic, because nobody wants to really move or touch any other self-expanding product. They use Medtronic, but they have to, small annuli, a valve-and-valve female patients. But the balloon system is also quite old, right? So when we came with a blank piece of paper, I brought physicians down to Minneapolis from the biggest centers in the U.S., Cleveland Clinic, Columbia, chosen for their volume, chosen for their podium presence, chosen for their publication volumes. So people who we knew that in the future would help us launch this product if it was successful. They all came to Minneapolis. I was surprised they all came, but they're big names. Had a blank piece of paper, walked them through the adapt tissue and said, I've got a building block. If you had a new product, what does it look like? And we had our engineers and everybody there. They said, it has to be balloon expandable. Check, thank you. If I didn't do that, we wouldn't have a product or a company today. It would be a different direction. And two, clinically better. So they were wanting that delivery system, but they still wanted a better valve than what they were getting with the Edwards valve. And so that's where we landed on having to create a whole new class of valve, because what they're asking for is, can you give us curative pre-disease mean gradients, 5 to 10 millimeters? The current products don't do that. And in order to do that, all of these valves are the same class. We couldn't get the bioprosthetic design to get to those pre-disease, and that's why they didn't have that result before. What we did do was create a new class of valve called biomechanics. So it's anatomically and physiologically looks like the valve in your body. And lo and behold, it's the first valve that gives you 5 or 10 millimeters of mercury, takes you into that curative zone.
Yeah, it's interesting. So there's a real trade-off between ease of use and outcomes in the existing set. Remember, we spoke to a surgeon who had done these procedures, and he said the Anteris valve was actually easy to use and had, the strong effect. It didn't really have that trade-off in the same way.
Yeah, and that was by design, of course, because if we came to market or we tried to come to market with the same issues, no one's going to use us. If you can use a Sapien and you still have bad hemodynamics, why would they use our product? So remember, going back, we were creating an investment thesis to see whether this company was going to exist or not. And the only way that was going to happen is if we had clinical differentiation. And if we didn't, I know nobody commercially, I've launched 36 drugs in my career around the world. So I do understand that to be commercially viable, you have to be clinically relevant. And if we weren't clinically relevant, particularly as a smaller company, no one's touching us. There's no investment thesis in the first place. So we had to nail the sweet spot. And the only way we knew what that was for the doctors to tell us, who do thousands of these things, and then decide whether we could actually achieve it. Wasn't realistic. It's like bringing someone and saying, well, we'll use your product if you can invent a time machine. Can you do it? Maybe not. Maybe you can. And so we're kind of in the same boat. It's like, can you invent something they don't actually have right now and no one's ever done before? But we did. I mean, and it was just a lot of, for the shareholders as well, a lot of sheer grit, tenacity, and incredibly talented people. Minneapolis is the medtech center of the world. So all the big companies' campuses are here. And as a result, you have all the infrastructure, animal labs, cadaver labs, medtech engineers everywhere for the last 50 years. So it's the only town where you could move this quick because you've got all the supporting infrastructure here. But it's just sheer grit and a lot of PhDs and a lot of doctors working on, animals and cadavers to get to the point where we are now with a clinically superior product by about 30% to the market leader.
And so that 30%, is that, what are you measuring there? Is that pressure? Is that blood flow?
So, well, it's actually a bunch of things, but the 30% part is what the conventional metric for this disease is, which we talked about before, which is the mean gradient. So they calibrate this disease, every clinical paper, every way when you're diagnosed and calibrated, it's your mean pressure gradient. So that's how they know if you're severe or mild or whatever. So if we take, let's say the SMART study, which is a very recent study by Medtronic, head-to-head between Medtronic and Edwards. And the good thing about this space is we have thousands of patient data. So it's not like we have to guess how we perform. We have over 100 patients, which is a lot for TAVR. And all of our patients, of course, are third-party call-out adjudicated. We don't touch the data, right? So it's all done in studies. And the mean gradients, for example, in a 22 mil patient in the SMART study, you're going to get about 20 millimeters of mercury off the table every day of the week. And any doctor will tell you this with a SAPIEN. When you're looking for 5 to 10 to be in the curative range, all of our patients from patient 1 to 115 or whatever we are today is 5 to 10 millimeters of mercury. And then you may have seen some of this data. You'll see doctors certainly present it and talk about it. And so that's the conventional metric. When you talk about the 30%, we're clinically curative, actually, when you get off the table where the others just cannot achieve that. For reasons we understand, it's not a fluke, right? This valve is completely different. It works differently. Now, on the back of... Yeah.
Sorry, continue.
Laminar flow. Something that's never been achieved, and it's because this valve is physiologically correct, is the only product with laminar flow. Laminar flow is a critical link to durability, mortality, heart failure, left ventricular hypertrophy. We've measured all the other valves, of course, in studies. Physicians are all over this globally, but this is the only valve with laminar flow. So even if you want to say mean gradients are great, and we've got the best by far for sure, and our delivery system is easiest to use, fine. This laminar flow part is incredibly important. And we reduce the left ventricle, and I won't get too much into that, but it's a clinical marker, by about 30% over 6 months. We don't see that with other products. That's a precursor to heart failure, which is what these patients die. They actually die of heart failure. And that's disease modifying. I mean, we're actually seeing a modification in the disease state because of our valve, because it's reduced flow, laminar flow. And of course, the mean gradients do matter. That the lower that pressure is, obviously, the better it is for the patient.
So spell that out, laminar flow, that's like less turbulence. Is that what we're talking about here?
Completely spot on. Yeah, disrupted flow is known to degrade valves very quickly. So the biggest killer of a valve, as much as the tissue matters, and we've got the gold standard with ADAPT, the biggest killer of a valve is turbulent flow. And here's the interesting thing: the current market leader has worse flow displacement, flow reversal than an untreated, highly stenotic valve. And we've measured that in patients in the 3D, 4D MRI. And so when you've got, now we know why those particular valves fail quicker. So the durability is not, there's no one with 10 years of data, but we do know that some of these valves are failing in 2 years. The ones with the highest amount of turbulence, which we can measure in patients on 4D MRI, actually have the quickest rate of degradation. And it's very clear what that linkage is, whereas we have normal to near normal laminar flow, like very, very little, if any, turbulence. And you see that on the flows. You see it on the 4D MRI. It's very easy to see in patients. I'm not sure whether you saw that in Sydney valves a few weeks back, but it's huge. And the physicians have not been able to achieve that before. So it's obviously got everyone's attention.
Got it. So why don't we zoom in a bit on the valve itself? Why is it achieving that laminar flow? And could you also talk about the material and the advantages of that as well?
Sure, yeah. So I think it goes back to when we were looking into the company and said, okay, we've got rid of the drug platform. What have we got left? Is there an investment thesis? And the ADAPT product, the ADAPT technology, the product is called CardioCell. There's a portfolio of ADAPT products that we use in surgical repair. So there are 55,000 patients with ADAPT inside of them globally, which comes from Australia. And so that was a starting point. So the first thing is tissue. Why is it different? Now, the Edwards valve, for example, is also made from bovine collagen, the same as ours. They treat theirs one way, we treat ours a certain way as well. The big difference starting with the tissue and the differentiation of the valve, our tissue was designed by Professor Needling in Australia over about 20 years to be acellular, meaning there is no remnant DNA, right? So remember, it's coming from another animal, it's going to go in your body. Every other tissue out there is decellularized, which means there are remnants of DNA in there, very, very small, whether it's in the surgical repair space for other companies or whether it's in fact an Edwards valve or a Medtronic valve, which is porcine. And your body responds to that DNA naturally. It's a foreign matter over time. It's very small, but your body will have an inflammatory response to that DNA, and that's the precursor to calcification. So this is a disease of calcium. So suddenly these valves are over time having that calcification problem because of the DNA. So we are, put it another way, acellular means zero DNA versus some DNA. So that's the first point, the tissue. 55,000 patients, it's the gold standard, but it's the price of entry. The tissue better be that good or you're not playing in this space. And physicians expect it. The valve design was our aha moment. That's the critical link. And I don't know why someone hadn't jumped on this before. The valves that are out there, be they surgical or whether they're TAVI catheter-based, are all in a certain class called bioprosthetic. So bioprosthetic is 3 pieces of tissue sewn into a frame, 3 flat pieces of tissue with about 800 sutures. Now, 800 sutures means 800 holes, by the way. So you have a problem with the integrity of the valve. The valve in your body does not look like that. The valve in your body looks like our valve, the DurAVR. And so when we had the blank piece of paper, when we had a target we had to hit from the physicians, which was clinically better, right? Taking the delivery system out for a minute, how are we going to get better mean gradients, those blood pressure measurements, from a bioprosthetic valve? Because it doesn't work like the valve in your body. And that's the bit I couldn't connect to. And we tried. We said, okay, doctors want this. We've got a blank piece of paper. A company's future depends on it or not. And we played around with the bioprosthetic design like everybody else. They're all bioprosthetic valves. And we couldn't get 5 to 10 millimeters of mercury. And finally, one of the very smart PhD engineers that we're lucky enough to have in our company, Jason, said, let's change the design. And no one had really thought about that because no one had ever thought about it. And so suddenly we created the first single-piece 3D molded valve. And it looks like the one in your body. The one in your body should look like 2 hands praying, and ours does. And that gives you a bigger coaptation zone, so you get a bigger opening and a lower mean gradient and more direct flow. All the other valves hinge at the top like a door, all of them bioprosthetic. And they dome at the top, so they narrow at the opening, so you get higher pressures, and they cause turbulence because they don't look physiologically like a valve in your body. And so that fundamental difference is that valve design and just taking a completely different approach to this. The single piece gives you much more structural integrity for durability as well. Perfect laminar flow, of course, gives you much more durability, but it's more the patient outcomes. I mean, we're getting pre-disease curative mean gradients, 5 to 10 millimeters of mercury, and we're reducing that left ventricle because of that flow going smoothly. The problem with disrupted or turbulent flow, it creates back pressure, and your heart has to push against that, your left ventricle. So the more pressure, the bigger your ventricle gets, and that leads to heart failure. So when you've got normal flow like ours, we're actually reducing the damage that's already on the ventricle. We've measured that by about 30% over 6 months only. So your disease modification is occurring with this product in a way it doesn't happen with the others.
Can we go through the clinical data then, the trials you've done so far, and any follow-up you've had with patients?
Yeah, this is data is data, and I've lived by data my whole career. Big studies, 5,000-10,000 patients and things in cancer and other areas. But what I really like about this is I've had a lot more proximity to the patient. So there is the data we have, which is pristine. And then there is the interactions that you notice with patients. I'll come back to that. So 110 patients across Europe and the US. We've had physicians from Cleveland Clinic, from Columbia, a lot of big centers have used our product. We've got a physician from Australia, Carl Poon from Prince Charles, who actually brought up overseas to implement as well. He's done an operation. There's an Australian physician over at Cleveland Clinic. He's done quite a few as well. So we look for the Aussie connections wherever we can get them. And there's a lot of involvement here from the Aussie side, of course. But the data is then adjudicated. So we've done what's called an early feasibility study, which is just the normal process of getting through this. You go from bench to animals to cadavers. Then you move from cadavers to your small human studies, and of course your bigger studies. And we've done an FDA EFS study here in the US as well. And that's when it gets very serious, right? You're under scrutiny. You can't touch the data. You can't go in the operations. It's all done by third parties, so it's obviously clean data. And so those studies have amounted in total to, I think, about 9 cohorts we're at the moment, so 9 different groups of patients over a period of 3.5 years now between the European and the US EFS. You see the results get slightly better from the first patient to 110. And that's because the physicians get a little bit dialed in. We've made a few tweaks on delivery as you're supposed to during this process. And 3 weeks ago, we did 20 patients in 5 days. That is commercial speed. So 25 minutes, I mean, it was crazy how much we got through. Now, the data is consistently putting our patients, whether they start with 40 millimeters of mercury, we've had some of those. We've had patients who have had 120 millimeters of mercury, which is off the charts. We've had those. They all get back to 5 to 10 millimeters, every single one of them. Right, so we've all got them back in the normal range. We've treated bicuspid, which is a particular kind of morphology. Very difficult to treat. I think we've probably treated 15 or 20 bicuspids. So that's pretty crazy stuff. When you do a big study, typically in medtech and pharma, you tend to look for the healthiest sick guys you can get into a study, right? Which means you, by exclusion criteria, you're looking to treat a disease, but you don't want the patient to have 10 other diseases that might make a mess of the study. That's not what we've got with these first 100. We have had some of the messiest patients you'll ever see, and the physicians will tell you that would not be normally included in a study because we wanted to push every boundary we could. We had confidence in the product after about the first 10, 15 patients. So we have treated these bicuspids I talked about, the 120 millimeter guy. I mean, it's really tough patients. And then we've got a bunch of valve and valve patients. So valve and valve is where patients have had a first replacement valve, it's failed, and they've had to put a second one. And it's a bit like salvage therapy. They're very sick. You can't crack their chest. Of course, they're too sick for that. And there's a lot of junk in there where that first valve has failed. So you've got to get a second valve in and try and get some result. You're never going to get a good result with valve and valve, right? They're always going to come out with a worse outcome than their first valve. And what we've seen, and we didn't go looking for these patients, hospital in Europe and Canada came to us and said, look, we've got this sick patient. Can we use this on compassionate use? It has to go through a regulatory process because it's not registered. We did 10 patients so far, valve and valve, and one of them was a triple. So one of them had a failed surgical valve, a failed Medtronic valve, and then they put in our valve. You don't ever see triples, they generally pass away. We've got a better mean gradient in all of those patients than when they got their first valve, which is crazy. These are patients with not good solutions. There's no dedicated solutions. Doctors don't have good solutions. And it's a growing phenomenon. They think it's going to be about 20% of the market or more by 2028 because we've only started treating younger patients since 2019, right? Before that, they died. So now you're getting 5-6 year points where these valves are now failing. $2 or $3 billion market by itself. We are definitely the only game in town for valve and valve. Every physician will tell you the results they get with DurAVR for the same reasons we get it in untreated patients, right? Is that valve design are getting mean to these patients that they didn't see when they got their first valve, when they should be much, much worse and a much worse outcome. So that's the patient population we're treating. Very, very challenging morphologies and anatomies and so on, and some and some more regular patients as well, but a lot of really difficult patients to treat. Great outcomes across the board. So that's the data. The data is then measured up against with the core labs. They do the scans, they read all the data. We're not allowed to just submit data. Then there is patients who I've met and I've seen. So I'm in a lot of these procedures. I'll scrub in, go in with the physicians. It's always a privilege, obviously, to do that. I'll see the patients before they go in. And this particular disease state, you can tell a patient is sick with a cardiac disease because their pallor is very gray. They have no energy. I mean, they look very sick. Some of them look close to death, and some of them aren't close to death. I interviewed one lady not so long ago, and she was hitting the 3-year mark. She was in her 80s. When we treated her, she looked terrible like a lot of patients. When I interviewed her, she looked 20 years younger, and even the physicians were marking on that. And that's because she suddenly had well, we don't know. Obviously, the product works really, really well. But if you get a sapien, for example, at 3 years, again, you're not healthy. So it's not like you come out of this and these patients, they'll get symptom relief, they'll get some mean gradient drop no matter what product you put in. But then in 2 or 3 years, again, they're looking pretty sick. They don't look good, even if they live for the next 6 years. This lady actually looked like she lost 20 years, and she said it. She was energetic. She was unbelievable. She was in her 80s. So this normal physiology, this normal flow, there's a whole bunch of things going on with these patients that, even the physicians will tell you, puts this product head and shoulders above, probably because of the normal physiology. So it's very interesting. The data supports it anyway. We have just the best data, no matter which way you cut it, consistently. But when you eyeball these patients, which physicians do often assess patients just visually, their pallor, their energy levels. The DurAVR patients look amazing 2-3 years out, which they probably typically shouldn't with this disease. And a lot of these patients are older, so they have comorbidities. They have other diseases that go along with not just the cardiac disease in your 80s. Of course, lots of things going wrong there. So it's pretty encouraging for the future. And doctors and I mean very high level, very famous doctors and big centers are all in behind this product for those reasons. It's just giving better outcomes.
Yeah, that's been consistent feedback from the surgeons I've spoken to. When can you help us do a bit of market sizing here? Like, how many operations are there? What's the existing opportunity? Is the market growing? How big is the valve in valve? You mentioned 2 to 3 billion. Can you help us size the market?
Sure, of course. And this is the interesting thing. I come from an industry where you look at incidence and prevalence when you size a market before you launch anything. So you get a feel for the disease state. And as a healthcare company, so I'm talking about Merck, you go in then 3, 4, 5 years before launch and you get the market ready for this particular product. And there'll always be competition. Now, when I looked at this market, the incidence prevalence data said to me that there was a $30 or $40 billion market here, US dollars. And that's just based on, and I couldn't correlate why the consensus on the street was it was $10 billion by 2028 US dollars, and that no one really had a model for it either, which is a little bit different for me. And then I understood that it was well understood that people were treating 15% of patients. So therefore 85 were not treated, and so everyone was fine with the fact that 10 billion is a big number. So, the truth is somewhere in between, and this excludes China, who by itself is probably a $60 to $80 billion market if you treated it. There's about 2 million AS patients above 65 there. If we go back into the US market, about 175,000 cases per year. But what I love about this condition particularly is that it's very compact to a number of centers. And you can look to say probably the top 60 to 80 centers in the States control a lot of the volume and certainly influence the rest. Now, I've launched drugs where I've launched 5,000, 6,000 reps around the world on day one. That's not what this is. And so when you size the market, you've not only got this big market, and it's not a mature market, right? It's a growth market, right? Obviously, they are starting to treat patients younger, so that pie is getting bigger. The market leader has 70% market share in the States, and we're 30% clinically superior and as easy to use as that product. And all the big centers know us, and they're behind us, and they're looking for alternatives. So when you start to think about that part of it, $10 billion, if they have 70%, by 2028, and we get 10%, it's $1 billion. Now, the centers we're going to launch we can cover with an additional 30 to 40 headcount. And then literally that's what I think a lot of people think a launch is a massive undertaking. It can be, certainly in pharma, but that's not what this market is. And we're not going to try and launch the world on day one. Even we have European approval and everything else. We obviously can go stepwise. We can be cash flow positive in the first 9 months just in the US post-launch. Valve and valve, they don't really know because it's just a growing phenomenon now, right? So some folks will say to you, it's 10%, 20%, 30%. What we do know, if you live long enough, it's 100%. Like all of these valves will fail. And it's very interesting when we started this journey about 7 years ago with a blank piece of paper, companies like Edwards would say our valve is valve for life. And there was no data to support that. And everyone just assumed it was correct. And then, of course, because they were putting them in 85-year-olds who were dead in 3 years. So, of course, it was. Right? No problems really pop up in 3 years. What they say now, from a commercial point of view, is choose your first valve wisely. So no one ever goes out and says valve for life anymore. And what they mean by that is use an Edwards valve first, because when it fails, and they're less worried about that part of the market for the moment, it's smaller for them than what they would get, then they say, pick another valve to go, like a Medtronic valve to go for your valve and valve. So they all acknowledge now that valves fail, and that you would pick a second valve. So they really anchor in on valve for life to now let's just choose your first valve wisely. So that market could be 30, 40, 50%. Physicians and people who are particularly skilled at valve and valve will tell you, Anita Asgar, for example, in Chicago, she'll tell you it's a tsunami, right, of failed valves. Now, I can tell you unequivocally the only game in town for valve and valve is DurAVR, and every doctor will tell you that just because of the results we've got today.
Yeah, amazing. How much do these procedures cost? What's typical cost per valve today?
Yeah, so the different aspects, and it's important to understand the healthcare systems around the world. So, I've had the good fortune in my career to manage pretty much every healthcare system in the world as president of Europe, head of emerging markets, CEO of Japan for Merck at one point, and so on. Now, there are essentially one kind of healthcare system around the world, which is a cost-based model like Australia, Canada, Europe, and then the US model, which is a profit-based model. And you'll see some of the data as to why these healthcare costs are so very, very different. Now, in the US, the sticker price for a TAVR, conventional TAVR today, is about 31 to 33,000 US dollars. That's not the procedure, that's the unit cost. Now, under the reimbursement systems up here as CMS, the procedure can be up to $100,000 for the physician time. And then you have all the DRG costs. But you, as a company, you don't have to worry about that. It's all covered by insurance. The unit price in Australia is different. Australia negotiates in a different way with companies. I believe it's more like 15,000 per unit down there. Either way, the cost of goods is not close to those numbers, and particularly at scale. So there is good margin on these products, but they are life-saving devices as well. I think it's justifiable for the prices charged. So do I see prices coming down with competition? It's possible. Doesn't happen in pharma. Prices go up usually, certainly in the States for drugs. And I think we're definitely going to take a health economic pharma style argument to the reimbursers once we can prove mortality benefits and other benefits like flow and particularly left ventricular remodeling, so disease modification. That comes with a price premium even in the pharma side, and the regulators understand that. So we're certainly looking to achieve that once we have the data to support it.
Got it. And what's the pathway from here to getting full approval in the United States?
Yeah, so there's the final step. We're actually at the final step now, which is the pivotal study. And we've been negotiating that. So you go through the processes we talked before. You have your early feasibility studies in Europe and in the US. The FDA says, fine, we like the product, we like the safety. A bunch of physicians lobby for you as well, so you have to have that. And I was down on the FDA campus in DC about a month ago, physically with our review team, the TAVI review team, with three professors, basically, who are very well known to the FDA, finalizing the final steps. Now, we have said publicly that we would make our submission for our IDE in Q1. We did hit that timeline. And so we're under the review process now. But of course, it's not like it's something you throw over the fence. You negotiate for a couple of years with your reviewers to make sure there's no surprises there, that they get that you take their advice on biostats and numbers. And so where we landed was a randomized study. So that means one of the first really head-to-head studies. Half of them will be DurAVR, half of them will be standard of care, which is, say, Edwards and Medtronic, and to the tune of 70-30, like the market. Primary endpoint is non-inferiority. And what that means is that you just have to be as good as the other guy in terms of all-cause mortality, which is a composite mix of disabling stroke, rehospitalizations, very normal stuff. And that's so it's really about the safety profile. Of course, we've already got enough data of patients to already know where that's going to land. It's not like there's any surprises there. It's not like a drug where things can change. It's a physical device. Things don't change. Our secondary endpoints are around hemodynamic superiority. We already know where we land with that. Things like the left ventricular remodeling, we're going to put that in the study as well. And then there's a valve-in-valve registry. So the valve-in-valve registry is just basically collecting patient data. It's in the same umbrella, but it's not head-to-head. We don't have to do it. So it's pretty straightforward. Collection of maybe 100 patients, collect that data. They'll approve us for that label. It's a global study, so it does include Europe. FDA has allowed us to put European patients in to get that number up, but the Europeans have also allowed us to get a CE approval with their sites. So of course we're bringing those on. So that's the first part. You negotiate the protocol. Once you've got enough data to give the FDA that they're satisfied with safety, efficacy, and so on, and then you qualify your sites. So the process we're in right now, and there's obviously a cost factor that goes up a little bit at this point, which we've already taken on. It's not like it's coming. We've already taken those costs where you have to have people out in the field. And those people are qualifying sites, getting the contracts organized, getting the hospitals ready once the FDA approves your protocol to then go forward and start the enrollment process across multiple sites. Now, physicians are hugely enthusiastic for this product. That's a fact. And you may have experienced that, but certainly here in the States, the demand to enroll in this study is greater than the hospitals we can support. Which means it will be a fairly quick study to go through. And in places like Cleveland's the biggest cardiac center in the world. So you can imagine the sheer volume that goes through there, and they've been on our advisory board since day one. So they're great supporters. But it's more the clinical outcomes. People are just excited and enthusiastic because they already know the data that want to give their patients this. Go through that period. There is a 1-year review with the FDA.
After 1 year for each patient, you mean?
The whole cohort. So you basically accumulate the whole lot, give it to the FDA. They follow up. You follow up at a year. But that's an important year because you already know what the data is. I mean, it's not like we're not allowed to control the data, but I certainly know from every single patient, I get texts all the time, just in a patient got 5 millimeters of mercury, even if I'm not in the case. So, of course, we'll know where we land, but this is not a product where you go through a study and you get a different result like a drug, right? There's been a few examples recently in Australia where a phase 3 study obviously went the wrong way. This is not what you have in medtech. It's not a phase 3. I've done a lot of those. It's a pivotal study, and the physical product doesn't change. There's no binary outcomes here. And that 1 year is when you're kind of putting some folks out in the field, you're building inventory. Most important, you've got to have stock to sell. And we have a facility here in Minneapolis, a factory, where we make valves now as we have to for the trial. And it's a decent sized factory. There are manufacturers that you have to have people making this stuff. It's all FDA qualified, engineering and all these things. And we can support commercial sales for at least the first 2 years with the facility today. And that's really important because that's built into the plan years back. And you can't just flick a switch when you get an FDA approval and say, now what? Right? You've got to plan that years out, and that's where we are today. Some of the costs we incur certainly around manufacturing. And then if we decide things are looking great in the first year, we'll obviously then think about whether we're cash flow positive, what investments we would need to make in more manufacturing to make sure we get more capacity going forward. And so those are the things we look at in that 12-month period. Now, Europe may come through earlier. There's no commitment either way on that one at the moment, but the CE process can be a little bit quicker. And so we might see a European approval, in fact, before we see US approval.
Right. And so is that approval, is that going to be based on that 1 year mark? Because obviously these valves can be in patients for many years.
But again, the critical marker they look at is actually the acute phase. So the first thing that the regulators look at is what do you look like when you get off the table, and obviously our product is superior by far on that front. They do look at the long term, but no one's actually got long-term data, and that's the interesting part of that. Some misnomers about who's got long-term data, durability. We now know why these valves fail. We know they are failing because the valve market is growing. You do have to do a 10-year follow-up, but that doesn't affect your commercial approval. They don't wait 10 years and approve you, but there's a commitment from all companies to follow patients for 10 years where possible. It's not always easy to keep these patients coming back, and they sometimes die of other things as well. So there is a 10-year follow-up period, but the actual approval is granted on the 1 year.
Got it. So give us a timeline then for when that would be, a rough timeline.
Yeah, so I think I've taken a conservative approach, as I always do, because of capital. You want to be sure you've got enough money to run a study, and we're looking around about Q4 26 to have it fully enrolled. Right, so come out the other side Q4 27, and pop outside of that with an approval early of 28. So we're in the barrel of that. Now, Europe could be up to a year earlier than that. So we don't really know. Valve and valve, I'm also not really sure. Valve and valve is such a huge unmet medical need that may or may not come out a bit quicker as well, because they need those products out there for valve and valve. And that's a pretty small registry kind of approach. So there are a few variables. I'm not going to commit to those at the moment until I get more clarity. But, I'm just working on conservative, longest case scenarios here.
And I guess you can actually charge for these valves, can't you?
We can in the study, again, a little bit different to a drug study, right? Where we actually get 25,000 US in the States for every one of our units in the trial. Obviously, it doesn't run the company, but it's still revenue. And the procedure is covered by insurance, by a group called CMS. So again, in a drug study, you have to pay for everyone else's drug and all your controls and whatever. Here, the hospital buys our product as if it was a commercial product. If you're in the control arm, or if you're in the randomized arm where you're going to get an Edwards or a Medtronic product, that's already covered in the system. So we don't pay for any of that. So the patient comes in, is going to get our product, Edwards product, or Medtronic product. Either way, it's all covered. And our product is acquired through the hospital as if it was commercial for 25,000 US dollars per unit. So not quite at the market level in a study, but certainly, beyond the cost of goods. Then there's the second part of the study. So the bit between approval and the final enrollment is interesting because you can have expanded access. What expanded access is that hospitals who have been in the study, and only hospitals have been in the study, so we've got a list of hospitals for this particular reason as well, are able to continue to use your product at will, at $25,000 on any patient they want before approval comes through. Now, any hospital that's not in the study cannot do that. But take Cleveland Clinic and some of these big centers that are all going to be in the study, they can continue to use the product before approval comes through. I don't have a good feel for the forecast on that yet. But certainly that's obviously something to look at. And technically, you could be picking up your first pseudo-commercial revenues Q1 of 27.
Got it. While we're on financing, Anteris was obviously ASX listed and is dual listed in the United States. Where does that leave you with cash, and how have you found that process?
Yeah, so obviously I become really comfortable. There's such different exchanges. I mean, I sat on a NASDAQ board, I sat on an ASX board. Uh, there's a tendency to understand that the pool of capital in New York is obviously bigger, and it is. Um, what I do find a little bit different, we've got some great healthcare funds in Australia that I really appreciate, but not a lot of them, not real experts. And so the tendency to look at all healthcare companies, I often find the distinction between medtech and pharma with some of the more generalist funds is not understood. Therefore, they don't necessarily understand the risks of a phase 3 versus a pivotal. And so you might get tied up in that brush and leads to a more diminished market cap than you'd like to see. And we'll talk about the current environment in a minute. Whereas in New York, you have like one of our biggest investors, Perceptive, is a dedicated medtech specialized fund. They know Edwards, they know Medtronic, they know the CEOs of those companies like they know me, and they know how to place your product in the market. The analysts are also really important. So the analysts that cover us, Barclays, Cowan, the those two particular other analysts up here that cover us, none of this is paid research. Of course, these are analysts. Wall Street looks at that stuff. And so people like Josh Jennings and Matt Mitzik, the Barclays and Cowan's analysts, are known, dedicated TAVR experts and have been for decades. And so, people read their notes. Again, they know the CEO of these other companies. They take your product, they know how to place it. So if you read their research, you get a very clear view. So that's one of the key differences. There are pros and cons, of course, right? We moved primary listing to the US. And literally, a couple of months after listing, the world falls apart because of issues around tariffs and market uncertainty. And, it's just one of the things. The markets are spring loaded up here. That's the critical part. The one thing you don't have up here is, I was in New York last week, the banks are not panicking about the market or about your stock. 40 other small caps in their portfolio that are down 70%. And so everyone realizes that it's just a macro issue. I think the ASX is a little bit more cushioned from what's happening in the US. But when you see the price of gold hitting a record high like it did today at $3,400 a troy ounce US dollars, and the VIX is off the charts, then you know it's a macro issue. Right? And I note today there's no rhyme or reason. A few weeks back, we were up 20% and the market were up 10 on that day. No rhyme or reason. Last week, we were up 18% on one day and the markets were up 0.6. Today, we're up 10% and the markets were down 2.5. And then on other days, we go down 15 and they go up 3. So there's no rhyme or reason. Today, surprised me. The markets were red. We went up 10%. So there's so much uncertainty. Well, what it does tell you is the market doesn't hate us, right? Because if you're not in good shape, they're not touching you at all. But there's just a lot of nuances, a lot of different players, a lot of certainly experts in the TAVR space, which certainly helps you when you're trying to get credibility in a tough market. When you've got people at that level saying, this product is the real deal for these reasons, and can quote the data, it certainly helps you. But they're just very different markets. I think I always have an affection, obviously, for the ASX. We have a lot of retailers and institutions, but this company, before I even got here, some of those retailers still carry through. Some people I've really come to have friendships with, I really appreciate. I communicate with them a lot. Some folks that are Aussie characters, and I just take great delight in having interactions with them. They're so funny and humorous and laconical, and some super smart people on our register from Australia as well. So I do enjoy that level of contact. And of course, our biggest shareholder is L1 out of Melbourne. And Rafi and his team have been with us for quite a number of years. There's a physician in their team, Andrew Lynn, who certainly has that ability to analyze the data as well. So it's just a different mix, but I really am appreciative of the folks we've got on the ASX, because some of them I've just known now for 6-7 years.
Got it. And how much cash do you have now after that raise?
Yes, we raised in and around 85 million US dollars. And I'm burning at the rate I said I would. So we're meeting guidance. I think we burnt about 20 in the first quarter, and we're on track to do roughly the same in this quarter. So we're on guidance with what we said.
Yeah, got it. And what's the mood over there in terms of the FDA, the firings? How are your friends in the industry seeing things?
Yeah, so like I said, we're very close. This is as close as I've ever been to the FDA in my 30 years in global healthcare, which is great as a small company. Big companies get good access, like when I was at Merck. But of course, we're on the campus in DC a few weeks back, and the firings had just started. Now, I think it's definitely happening a lot on the pharma side versus the device side. But there's a lot of indiscriminate federal job downsizing. I'm going to put it that way across the. So there's a lot of uncertainty with federal workers. The FDA is definitely caught up in that. Our review team, who are TAVR experts, are seemingly untouched at the moment because you take them out, who's going to review TAVRs and valve products and whatever. So you've got kind of that expertise. But I think everyone's a little on edge because you see not only what's happening with the federal workers, certainly what's happening with the federal government. The tariff discussion has just put everything into a spiral, and we saw the markets collapse as soon as that came out.
For manufacturing in Minneapolis, that shouldn't be such an issue for you.
So I made a decision, honestly, and here's the thing, the other valve companies, Edwards and Medtronic, do manufacture, because these are very labor intensive, these valves. Now, ours are less labor intensive because of the single piece 3D design, right? So it can take about 24 hours to make an Edwards valve, about 6 hours to make one of ours. So that will eventually run down to the bottom line as we get into commercial scale. But a lot of that stuff is done outside the US for the reasons of labor costs. And we were adamant we're going to do it all here. As it turns out, it's 100% done here. Minneapolis, because it's a medtech hub, also has contract manufacturing for medical products. So our catheters, of course, are made by a third party literally next door to us. But all the valve manufacturing, the tissue is made in Australia, right? So that's done in Malaga and Perth. We have a factory there with about 20 folks, and that's going to stay there. But fortunately, due to the history between the US and Australia, we have a 10% tariff market with Australia. So I'm not too worried, but everything else is made in the USA. So we have zero exposure to tariffs at this point. For what it's worth moving forward, who knows?
Got it. This may be a harder question. I guess a challenge when you're looking at a company like Anteris is trying to understand how the rest of the field is moving, because ultimately you're not changing you're chasing a moving target. In 2 years' time there might be other products in the market, there might be drugs available. Obviously Medtronic, Abbott, Edwards, they're all going to be innovating as well. What are you seeing on the innovation front from other companies that we should be aware of? And I understand as CEO of Anteris, you may not be best placed to answer this, but it'd be great to get your views.
No, totally, because it's absolutely my job to understand the competitive landscape, like it was at Merck, like it was at Roche, and it certainly is at Anteris. If we create an investment thesis around a product that has clinical benefit, you've got to understand the competitive landscape. The last thing I want to do is raise capital for 8 years, have a product come out the other side, and there's a competitor product that's better from day one. That's not a good feeling. I would deserve to be shot for that. And so you have a whole function in your company where you're looking at competitive and strategic landscape. On the back of that, I do meet regularly with Edwards, Medtronic, Abbott, Boston, and J&J regularly with the leadership teams. Well, they seek us out and have done for a long time. And we have talked about deals. So we're not strangers to each other. I mean, Medtronic's in my backyard here. I have dinner and I have meals with these people, and we talk about a lot of things, but certainly I've talked deals as well. So, but the biggest source of your competitive intel is those companies' business development teams, because that's who our teams interact with. So the J&J guys, they scan globally. If they say we're going into valves, they look at every valve from Germany to Africa to wherever. And so your BD teams, like I had at Merck, I had BD teams globally. You're sourcing product everywhere. And when they come to us and they'll look at our valve data and whatever and say, wow, this is the only game in town, or it's the best product in the world, do you get a lot of that feedback? Do I take that with a grain of salt? Yes. If I relied on that, I wouldn't be doing my job as well. Then, so use the industry, use the bankers, right? If there's competing technologies, they're talking to the funds. They're trying to raise money in New York, right? So I know who's out there. I know who talks to my bankers and all the funds that we talk to. And I don't just talk to our investors. I talk to a wide mix of funds who aren't invested in us and constantly have these discussions. So you know who's talking around. So there's that part. Then there's the physicians. So we work with physicians who are well known to be the best at their jobs. As you know, then you've seen our list of people. Of course, other companies who have competing technologies or hope they have competing technologies try and get those guys to work on ad boards the way we did, right? So they'll tell me, oh, this company popped up. A lot of them are in Minnesota because it's a medtech hub. So when these companies start off, and they start here or Geneva or Israel, they tend to be the three places. So we put all of those bits of information together. We scan all the research journals, all the data that comes out of that. And yeah, there are people, but the biggest thing that keeps you safe is once you've locked in like we did, And remember, there was a gap in the market. So we were the competing technology. We came out with that innovation that Edwards didn't do for 10 years. And then why would Edwards try to buy me? Well, we've had those discussions, Bob. Medtronic try and buy us. It's because they didn't innovate. Once we got in there, we locked it in with IP. So I had IP lawyers in the room from day one with those physicians. Valve frame, suturing patterns, the catheters, the delivery systems. The packaging box has some utility because you can use it in the OR to help prepare the valve. We IP that. There are just dozens of granted patents for our products. Now, so therefore, we own this class of valve. It's a new class of valve. It gives you the pre-disease results, and that's why you get them, because it's a new class, different design. But you can't copy it because we have all the IP. You can't copy our delivery system. So if someone's creating something that looks and works differently to the valve in your body, because that's what we did, we created a biomimetic valve, physiologically, anatomically correct. I don't personally know what you can do beyond that to get a better mean gradient than a curative result. But we give you a pre-disease mean gradient. So if someone got a technology that's going to give you better than a pre-disease mean gradient, there's no such thing. Or we're going to give you better than normal laminar flow, no such thing, right? So it's normal or it isn't kind of stuff. So we've kind of landed in that spot. I only see that any change, and physicians will tell you that, the banks will say it's not my opinion on whether this product is revolutionary, breakthrough, but we have shifted the discussion, right? We are the guys, that guy on the podium out front, and that's why the companies talk to me, and that's why these physicians work with us. And the biggest names in the industry don't get on a podium on our behalf and present data to make themselves look stupid, right? Or if there's a better technology that's going to, they all want to save the universe. So there's a lot of data points you put together to know where you stand. But I think the big one is your IP protection. If you don't get that right, well, yeah, you're going to get blown up in the middle. And so, it's a matter of clinical outcomes and a bunch of other things. Pharmacotherapy, you mentioned. I do want to address that because that's where I come from as pharma. I understand pharmacotherapies. This is the disease where the calcium builds up on your leaflets, predominantly, to a point where the leaflets become heavy and they close up the opening to your aorta, right, which restricts the opening, which raises the pressure. And then you get turbulent flow because of all the disruptions in there, all the irregularities. The only way you can treat that with a drug, and that's why there's no drug for this disease, is to find a drug that will actually burn that calcium out of the leaflet. Now, if you're burning calcium out of a leaflet with a you've got to get it delivered in the right place. The drug has got to land on those leaflets, which how you get from the liver or the kidneys to the leaflet, I have no idea. It would be a bit like chemotherapy where you've got to blast the body. Two, if you're burning calcium off leaflets, you're going to be burning the leaflets. Right, so there's no imaginable chemistry that I can, and I grew up in biotech oncology at Roche, the biggest oncology company in the world, with all of this really cool biotech tumor-based targeted therapy stuff. So I get targeted therapies. I grew up in it, and there is no way conceivable that I can see that you can target calcium on a leaflet with a drug today. There is some recent research from some existing classes of drugs used for other diseases, which they believe could slow down the calcium cascade, but it can't reverse the disease. And that's very early data. It wasn't core lab adjudicated. I've read this data. We all know about it. Core lab adjudicated means a third party has looked at the data as opposed to someone in the lab doing it and saying, look what I got. There is a difference. But some of that data, if I'm generous with it, I would say if you start taking that drug in your 20s, you might avoid stenosis, or you might slow it down, but you cannot reverse it. And so where we are today, and even to prove that point, you're years away. That's a big study, thousands of patients, lots of years. So it's a long time before that becomes viable. But there is no drug where I'd say that I can see and understanding the chemistry of this. Today you've got stenosis. I can either give you a valve or give you a drug. It's just not possible as we stand here today. And on the backside of getting innovation from the other companies, don't forget that if for some reason one of these companies developed a new product tomorrow, they are 7 or 8 years behind us. They don't just snap their fingers and come to the market. They've got to go through exactly the same process: FDA, first studies, pivotal studies, and so on. And we watch all the patent filings as well. We monitor the patent office to see if anyone's filed anything new or something we don't know about. Nothing. We just did one last month, actually. So, yeah, so these are all the ways we keep track of things.
Okay, helpful. And just in terms of strategy, I mean, how do you think about financing, partnering? um,
Yeah.
M&A? Like, can you talk about that?
Sure, and I do. Like I mentioned earlier, we meet fairly regularly with the other companies, at the senior management level, and so we do have these discussions. I grew up again at a time in pharma where Roche acquired Genentech, right, piece by piece and incrementally. And Roche is number two drug company in the world. It's massive. That's where I worked originally. Started in China. And both companies did really, really well. Genentech did well, if you know the story, and Roche did well. Eventually, Roche acquired them not so long ago and became the biggest oncology company in the world. So those kind of co-development, co-commercialization deals were at Merck. I did a co-commercialization with Bristol Myers Squibb, BMS, on a cancer drug. We both did well out of that. And that medtech is maybe a different approach. My view on this, and I talk to companies, I will absolutely entertain a co-promotion deal, like a partnership, that says, look, you guys can take Europe, we'll take North America, we'll use some resources, so on. It's a very compact market, so we can do that. I contemplate a co-development deal, but we don't really need it at this point. We're into our pivotal. So there want to be some big gain for us on the other side, because I wouldn't give up royalties for that. I would not contemplate an acquisition deal at the moment. We have had offers. And the simple fact is that the valuation curve, I use a net present value. I know you're a math guy, Michael. I use an NPV. It's not blind hope or dumb ambition when I value our company. It's a net present value model I used at Merck to launch multi-billion-dollar drugs. So it's not a Mickey Mouse model. And it lands at a very different number to our market cap. And one could argue as to why. I've got a very conservative NPV. But if you know NPVs and you know there's a TAM here of $10 billion, and you're superior to the market leader, it doesn't take a great leap of faith to work out where that market cap ultimately will head. Isaac Newton is right. Gravity will take over at some point. And therefore, doing an acquisition at 500 million or $1 billion doesn't make sense when 3 years later you might have a market cap of 5 billion. And it all sounds a little unhinged, but the math definitely is your friend in this scenario, regardless of where the markets are at. And there's a general skepticism around a development-based company, and some folks maybe not even understanding a pharma company and a medtech company have different risks. Like our level of risk is down dramatically. And think about this, the NPV will always come true. But because of market dynamics, because of a bunch of stuff, we're at the most de-risked point in our life cycle with 100 plus patients, right? And we're trading, we're trading at, let's take the ASX. Yet 2.5 years ago, I presented those first patients. We had 15 and we had a share price of $28. Right, it went from 15 to 28 literally within that week when I presented that patient data. And yet we've got a lot less risk, a lot more money in the bank, and we're staring down the barrel of our registration study. So there's no rhyme, no reason. People often try and conflate a share price with a problem in the company. And a lot of the ASX folks, well, what's the problem? And I'm like, well, firstly, if there was a problem, I'm legally obligated to tell the markets. So you can just take that off your mind for a minute. If there was some major drama here, I have to come to the markets to tell you, otherwise I'm going to end up in an orange jumpsuit. And so, people have got to understand that if they haven't heard something bad, then there's probably nothing bad. And secondly, that the risk levels for our company are far lower than they were 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and so on, and far lower than a phase 3 study for obvious reasons in the market. We have one recently in Australia. And that's kind of spooked people a little, and it's just a binary outcome in a phase 3, which is not the case for a pivotal with medtech. So I think there's a little bit of frustration, but also you get kind of scooped up into people combining medtech and pharma together when they're just very different animals from a risk point of view and an investment thesis.
Definitely. So what can we expect of the rest of the year?
Yeah, this is a
Near
big
term.
year. Yeah, this is obviously a very big year. Beyond the NASDAQ and those things that happened along the way here, which in itself is actually quite a milestone. We just crossed over 100 patients. That's obviously a milestone. We will, in line with our public statements, get our FDA approval to start the IDE, and that's coming. That submission has been made. It's under review. There's a statutory time frame. We know what it looks like. And we'll get out the other side of that and commence that first patient in around about July-ish in the summer up here. That's a huge milestone. So there's a couple more in the background that may or may not come to fruition, so we won't get too much into that. But it is really, by far, will be the biggest year for milestones for us in the company's history. And then beyond that, then it's all just, finish the study, get the approval, do the Europe thing, get the valve indication, and so on.
Yeah, got it. I thought it was interesting earlier when you said that pharmaceutical companies try and pick the healthiest patients in a trial, which obviously is a plague in early stage trials, because often, an open label study will do better than what historical data would suggest, and then companies raise a lot of money, but ultimately it's not real. So your
Well, I would say
background,
it's not. Yeah, I wouldn't say it's not real. I've run
well, the
studies.
trial might go on to fail.
Yeah, well, we run studies of 5,000 to 6,000 patients at Merck globally, and I've been involved in those. But I think you have a protocol that has exclusion criteria, and I think, to be fair, it's yes, you want to get an approval, but no, you won't do anything dangerous at a big drug
Mm,
company, right? You definitely look for it, but you try to just pass out all the comorbidities, and you're dealing always with sick populations like cancer. Or older patients, they're going to have 25 things wrong with them that could influence
mm,
the outcome unfairly, right? So if your drug doesn't get approval for cancer because people died of diabetes along the way, so these are the things you want to know. So you're looking for the disease that you're treating, check, they've got to have that. Then you're trying to rule out other things that might cause a high mortality rate unrelated to your drug. So we talk about the healthiest sick guys. And it's true for everything, and I don't have a problem with trying to just zero in on your particular product and try and exclude any other diseases that will influence the data. TAVR is the same. TAVR patients are older. They have a bunch of things often going wrong with them. And my point before is when you look at the TAVR studies where people got registration before, the exclusion criteria is big, right? And we didn't exclude those patients. We included patients that every physician who's worked with us will tell you would never have got into the other early TAVR studies. And the reason we did that was because we could be, one, a bit more bold and a bit more confident when we were confident with our data. But we wanted to test the limits. If I'm going to go out there and say we're going to be 30% better, we better be. And we better know that along the way, or that we've got good flow and less side effects and all those things. So you really want to know that early on. So that's why we picked up patients with 120 millimeters of mercury on a mean gradient. They would never make a study, those patients. I was in the room with one of those one day. I was nervous. Patient looked incredible, left the hospital with 8 millimeters mercury a day later. Pretty incredible
yeah,
stuff.
incredible. Yeah. Well, it must be, how does it feel working in the medical device space rather than in pharmaceuticals? Because then you do have those days where the whole program can be cancelled or be an amazing success.
Yeah, look, 30 years of bringing healthcare products around the world to people. I mentioned the regions I'd controlled before. I've got 5 doctors in the family here in Minneapolis. My brother-in-law, one of my close friends for many years, is an interventional cardiologist. And so, it's a part of my DNA. But I tell you, when I go and see patients or I hear doctors talk about our product and know that part of this came from Australia, part of it was designed here, you had your head in part of the development, and you see those patients doing really, really well. At this point in my career, that's a very, very good feeling. And I think it's important for the investment thesis. We're not just making widgets. Now, some companies can fail when they try to do that, and that's unfortunate for shareholders. We're not that company at the moment, so shareholders can feel really good. I know there's been some up and down times for everybody, but we've created a product. We did what we said we would. We're creating better outcomes for patients than they had before in this fatal disease, and ultimately, the financial part of the thesis will catch up with the clinical side of it. So it's a very good feeling to hear doctors globally say, "Wow, this product is just so incredible." And I mean, the biggest names in the world on the podiums are saying that about our product that we've all been involved in. So it's a really, really good feeling. And now the share price has just got to catch up with the rest of the good feelings and and meet the market and meet everybody's expectation on the SP. I think we've met everyone's expectation on the science and development. I think what's lagging obviously is the share price to catch up with those expectations.
Well, maybe that gap creates an opportunity. Why don't we wrap up there, Wayne? That was really fascinating. So thank you so much for the time.
Oh, you bet. Thanks, Michael. I love the way you're approaching it. Very matter of fact, but just great questions that allow me to kind of talk about the company